Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, one and all. I'm extremely happy to be again here for our DevOps Practitioner series. Today, I have a guest who comes all the way from Brisbane, Australia, Paul Colmer. We call him the digital coach, and we will see what he's up to. He's a fellow DevOps Institute ambassador, and I had a chance to chat with him yesterday. And now he's on with us for a blind date. So welcome, Paul Colmer, for this session of DevOps Practitioner series. How are you doing?
Thank you so much, Suresh. I'm absolutely doing fantastic, and it's so great to be here. So thank you so much for inviting me along. I do a lot of work on Agile and DevOps and cloud, so it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And like we said, it's the blind date, so I've no idea what you've got in store for me. So I can't wait.
Can't wait. Absolutely. So I wanted to take one topic as a part of the subject when we do a practitioner series. And today, the topic that I wanted to discuss with you is everybody, today, the most abused word is digital transformation, because everybody thinks digital transformation from a different perspective. So my first question would be, what is digital transformation from a layman's perspective? Is that a predominant definition that people can kind of relate, or is just kind of people looking at different parts of the equation and say, this is what digital transformation is? So what is your thought about digital transformation?
Yeah, so digital transformation, as you know, means different things to different people. My definition is a little bit unorthodox, I guess. So the definition for me is an organization that is digitally transforming and doing that successfully is an organization that is learning faster than their competition. It's as simple as that. So when we think about delivering value, if we think about delivering software, which is a form of value, we can think about doing not just one release a day, but multiple releases a day. In other words, multiple releases of value. And those releases of value are really learning opportunities. And the faster that we can push out those learning opportunities and meet our customers' needs, the more likely we'll stay in business. And then as part of that digital transformation, how do we then become faster at learning? By using technology, by using the talent that we have, our people, and by using, I guess, the processes, the events that orchestrate those things. And so for me, very, very simply, that's digital transformation.
That's nice. So that leads out to logically to the next question, because for me, in most of our client engagements and talking with a lot of leaders across the world, one of the biggest challenges about creating the culture change or a cultural shift. So I wanted to kind of break down into that. Is there a kind of a magic pill that you would advise? How do you create that culture shift, be it organizing themselves in terms of pods, in terms of squads, or what is this culture change, and how is it going to, is there any way of blueprint that you can create that culture change where I can do it in small, mid-sized to large enterprises?
Yeah, a lot of people, I think, when they start with culture change, like you say, they think about squads, they think about Kanban, they think about the practices. For me, it boils down to something a little bit simpler. You have a team, and maybe multiple teams of people that all have certain habits. And those habits lead to behaviors and lead to a culture. Now, you've got to understand, what does good habits look like? And so that's the first challenge. What does that look like? And there's a great cultural model out there called Western. We talk about generativity, and basically there are lots of positive behaviors that we can attribute to that generative model that we want to see. So things like people frequently and regularly collaborating, regularly seeking feedback from each other. So having maybe daily meetings, for example. I don't mean hiding behind emails. I mean getting on the phone, maybe getting on a call, and actually talking and discussing these challenges, being very sort of open and transparent. So for me, that's really what the beginnings of cultural change is all about. It starts with people, and it starts with doing something different. So the first thing I always say to people, do something different every day. And they sort of look at me and go, what do you mean, Paul, do something different every day? Well, what do you do in the morning? Well, I'll go for a lovely walk. I said, well, where do you normally go? Well, I usually do the same route, every day. I said, well, next time, mix it up. Change a small part of that route and do something different. Because you might meet someone you never met before. You might see something you never saw before, and you'll get a different result. And then all of a sudden, you can use that different result to do something different the next day. And so it perpetuates. So you've got to start with those small pieces. And for me, that's the very raw beginnings of cultural change.
That's great. And now, the biggest problem that I see in terms of culture changes, do you expect the culture change to happen from the individual, or do you think that it has to be driven from the leadership in terms of the norms? Because people say that the cultural norms and stuff has to be set at the leadership level. So I'm trying to kind of be puzzled as a cutest little wonder kid. What would you think? Would it be start with an individual, or is kind of a mix and match? How do you kind of play it?
Yeah, I think it's really important to recognize there are two parts of the equation. You outlined them beautifully there. There is a responsibility on leadership to walk the walk. So they need to know what it is they must do. So they have to understand what that culture looks like, and they need to become that change. They need to be behaving in a way that means other people can see that they're changing, and they will then follow them as role models. So leaders have a very important role to play in setting an example. Great example. Do you remember? I think it was a couple of years ago. Elon Musk, right? I love Elon Musk, right? Big fan of Elon Musk. Do you remember? He was sleeping on the factory floor, and no doubt there was a lot of written about him sleeping in the factory. And people trying to work out why was he doing that. And he was setting an example. He was saying effectively to his workers, "Look, guys." I'm the CEO. I should be putting the most hours in, and I want to be with you on that shop floor. So when you come in, we're there working together. And he was very collaborative and very hands-on in that whole shop floor experience. And really, that's an example of a leader absolutely leading by example. That's the most important thing, I think.
Sure. So that drives the point of how do you handle failure? We have been talking about in DevOps the third wave of continuous experimentation and learning. Look at failure as an opportunity. Look at more from focusing on providing a psychological safety environment as part of DevOps leadership. Now, how much is that really true in the kind of pressure that we all are to make profitability, time to market, beat the competition? Is that something doable in terms of fail fast and learn, or is just like it's like a hype that people just say and talk, but they don't follow it? I mean, just give us a practical example of how you see organizations are adopting to the concept of failure and providing a platform for people to experiment.
Yeah, so I work with a whole range of different organizations. And again, if we look at the Western model and we look at generativity, we find that organizations, and particularly leaders that exhibit those skills of transparency, of openness, of talking about what's really going on, not giving us the political bluff almost, telling what's really happening on the floor, and being honest, like when they're having a tough time. COVID-19 being a great example. Really good example of a leader at DXC called Cillian. I used to work with him. He's having daily calls, and he was very open and honest about what was going on, to the point at which he had a little bit of a moment with his people. And for me, that's the true honesty, and I think that's what's really required of leaders, is really to have that open and that honesty. And on the part of failure, really, we've got to think about failure as really learning and failure being the same thing. If we just fail and fail, that's no good. We want to fail and learn from that. And by failure, we really mean we want to run an experiment and learn what elements of that worked and what didn't. Now, in some organizations, it's harder than others to put that experimentation in place, but there's no doubt if you want 100% predictability, you're going to probably get 0% innovation. And often, senior leaders want innovation. Well, you need to sacrifice some of that predictability. And also accept that in any program, you probably only know 60 or 70% of really what you're doing. The other 30% has to be experimentation, because you've never done the nuance of that before. And in a more generative organization, that number may be higher, that allowing for experimentation. So with companies, depending on your culture, if you're more on the pathological or bureaucratic side, which is the left and middle of the Western model, you're probably going to limit yourself to 20% of that experimentation. In more generative companies, maybe 50%. But simple examples are, when we have an outage, limit the blast radius. Have that outage for 50 of the 50,000 users. Don't have the outage for 50,000. And some people would say, well, we don't want any outages. Well, the only time sometimes you know whether something works is when you put it in production, right? So
absolutely.
You've got to accept you're going to have downtime. Who does not have a service desk? Everyone has a service desk, because we accept there's going to be downtime. And so that's an important thing, I think. There's a good example, I think.
In terms of COVID-19 that you brought in, one of the things that's challenging is about the employee engagement, because a lot of people are still not sure about whether I will still be relevant, will I still have a job, and will I be on the card for a pink slip or a retrenchment. So what would you be the psychological state in such kind of a scenario where we absolutely don't have a clue of what's this going to turn around? So what should be the way you look at in this situation of employee engagement and making sure people are being productive? How do you kind of work on that? I mean, is there any kind of a secret sauce in terms of how do you
Um,
do that?
I think the key it's the old DevOps problem. If you're a manager or a leader and you're working with a team, managing a team, or maybe you're a team leader working with another team, I think the most important thing is communication. Having meaningful and frequent communication and open communication. So discussing, maybe some of the barriers that you're finding, some of the challenges you're finding at home. Um, I'm really fortunate. I'm in a great place. I've worked from home for many years. I have a very organized structure around my day. You can see I have a dedicated space, which is really, really important. And those things really help me manage working from home and manage that psychological aspect. So in some ways, I don't feel I'm cut off. And then I'm using communication, using social media. I've got a rule. I make 5 phone calls a day, calling people up, even people I haven't spoken to for years, purely just to reconnect and to get the social. And you never know, there might be something coming of that. So I think communication is really the key. And then obviously you have to know your employees, know their strengths, know their weaknesses, and know when they're struggling. And it's down to yourself as a leader to provide the best environment for that person to thrive. So if someone's not thriving, often it's a case of, oh, that person's doing something wrong. No. Have a look at the environment. Are they set up to fail? Do they need more mentoring? Do they need more support? Maybe they don't have dedicated space at the office. Maybe they need to come into the office. Some people can't work from home. So it's really leaders understanding all those aspects and then giving the best environment for those individuals. Yeah.
We do talk about comms in DevOps, about culture, automation, lean measurement, but I'm very focused on sharing. How much of the environment that you've seen, that people are pretty open and receptive to share ideas, bring in new things, and have the passion of sharing and learning? Is that really happening, or people want to kind of cling on to their ideas because they don't want someone to steal the ideas and look to be more smarter than them? How do you kind of play that out in terms of sharing as a key element of culture change?
Yeah. I think sharing is very personal. So I like to use the word collaboration. Like you say, we use S for sharing, but collaboration is really the word that I really like and I get excited about. And really, it depends on your personal journey. So very much early in my career, I was very skeptical of others. I didn't trust people so much. I wasn't so open to sharing. And then I thought of it, why don't I run an experiment? Why don't I start sharing certain parts of my material and not share other parts with different types of people and see what the result was? And there was no question. I did an experiment. I ran it for about 6 months. And no question, when I started sharing things, magic happened. People talked to me, opportunities came up. I think sharing collaboration is a way of maximizing the range of opportunities you can pick from. It gives you options. One of the principles in Scales Agile is to preserve options. So when you can maximize your options, that's really for me the way I like to live, is to try and how do I maximize the scope and options. There are times, of course, when that becomes too much. You go, geez, I've got too many options. That's where you want to narrow. So you want to have this expanding and narrowing funnel that is matched almost to your mental state. Too much opportunity can overwhelm you. Too little opportunity can make you feel, oh, am I worthless? Am I not progressing the way I want to go? So that's one way I look at that, I think.
Great. Now, in terms of metrics, and I get this bewildered in terms of how metrics are measured, and particularly on our DevOps part, because the traditional way we used to measure was based on teams, application development teams, operations teams. So they were measured by response time, resolution time, where here the number of features being deployed. Now, how much of the culture change is given importance to have a common unified metrics across the value chain, and where do you think where some of the common metrics that we can provide to have as a single team, as opposed to looking at, I'm at this team, I'm a part of this squad, I'm part of the Scrum team, this is what I manage. How do you build that common unified metrics across the value chain?
Yeah, so there's so many aspects to look at in terms of measuring. So when I was working at DXC Technology, the first thing we really focused on to start with was more around the work. So, you know, how many stories do we have? Does that make up the scope we need? And are we going to do it within the time frame? So we use something called a cumulative flow diagram to see basically how we're, like a burn down chart, how are we burning through the stories? And then we got to a point about, hang on, some of our people are faster or better at consuming or working through those stories, and others are getting better results. Why is that? So then we started to realize that the higher performing people were the ones that are interacting more often with myself. This is on Australia, the team, by the way, they were dispersed across the four corners of Australia. We had an ops team as well, based in Malaysia. We also had a development in Vietnam, and then I had architects I worked with in the UK and US. So we had like maybe a 25 virtual team, which we chunked up into a smaller part of what we call an agile release train. And what was very important is that we saw that people, high performers, were the ones that were connecting more often and spending less time behind their desk and more time collaborating either on the phone or in video conference. So we started to look at that as a potential metric. So for me, there are obviously a lot of metrics you can look at. You can go and Google, morale metrics. You can look at cumulative flow diagrams for work metrics. But then there are experiments you can do. An important part of metrics is understanding when you give someone a metric, what behavior does it drive? And the only way you'll ever know that is to try it. You can theorize all you want. You can say, I'll give them a bonus and you'll expect this. Trust me, give them a bonus, or give salespeople bonuses, and the results will probably be different to what you realize, especially when you start measuring it. And often it doesn't always give you the result you want. It gives you unintended results. So a good example of paying sales guys, big bonuses and so on. This is always true, but then they might neglect the way things are delivered because they go, hey, I met the target, I've got the sales. So be careful about how you incentivize people. So I think that's the biggest thing about metrics. You've got to experiment, try them out, and see what the results are. And does it give you the result that you want?
Yeah. And in terms of this digital age, a lot of people are talking about productivity improvement. A lot of people are talking about building a high performance team. So what are some of the characteristics to build a high performance team? And what does it take in terms of culture, people, process, technology to build that high performance team? Is it that you need to kind of have this, in the Phoenix project, we used to have like people like Brent. Do we need to hire superheroes to become a high performing team? Or do you need to have people, ordinary people doing ordinary things extraordinarily well? What's your take across to build a high performance teams? How do you kind of breed high performance teams in projects?
Yeah, well, let me share a real experience with you. So at DXC Technology, I was in a role where we wanted to roll out my work style, which is a series of offerings globally. It's basically an Office 365 mini private cloud. I went to the CTO and said, look, we understand you bought a whole heap of infrastructure. We can bring that over to Australia and reuse that. And we need to build a team. And the first part about building a high performing team in particular is you have to know the people really well. So I was fortunate enough to be able to go through and select, not all of them, but a number of the engineers that I knew. So I'd had a relationship with these guys. They knew how I worked. I knew how they worked. I think from memory, we had about 12 to 15 engineers at its height, and probably neither I knew well. And it's all about relationships and trust. So when you know people, they trust you, you can build on that. Some of the people, there were 4 or 5 people I didn't know very well. So I had to work extra hard building those relationships and understanding those people. And again, it's really the quality of the interactions, understanding when, for example, one of my lead engineers was struggling with something. We talk through it, we understand. And the important thing is to allow your people to come up with solutions. So I might have been the lead architect, but I don't come in and go, hey guys, we've got a problem. I think we need to do bang, 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 bang. No, guys, we've got a problem. Any ideas? What are we going to do? This is what we're trying to get to, guys. Any great ideas? You work through those ideas. It can take a little bit longer, but I think you get a better result. And it builds trust because people rarely resist their own ideas. So for me, that was the starting point. And there were many other sort of techniques along the way. But for me, I think that's the most important thing. Know their strengths and weaknesses and get to know them as people is probably the number one.
So my last question, I think we can talk hours because it's so enlightening. We have this generation divide. We have the Gen X, Y, and the millennials coming in. How is it practical to kind of work together in such kind of an environment of so much different people? Expectations are different, the priorities are different. So how do you bring those kind of blended model where we are able to coexist, leverage from either expertise and actually still work, because each and every one has got their own pros and cons. So what's the kind of the way you will manage the generational gap when you work with multifunctional teams and cross collaboration and stuff? How do you handle that from a culture perspective?
Wow, that's a hell of a question to finish on, my word. So again, let me talk from personal experience. So my current partner, I consider she's early 30s and I'm mid 40s. So it's fair to say there's a generational gap there. So I guess I'm not sure on the different things. Am I a Gen Y? I'm not sure now. But there's a little bit of a generational gap there. And so the challenge that certainly we've had is really around communication expectation. We have different expectations of life and we communicate in different ways. So the important thing, and again, COVID-19 sort of solidifies some of these things, we need to be very flexible about the way we work. Generally the way a lot of companies work, even today, I can't believe it. You get in at 8 and you finish at 4 or 5, right? Is probably 60% of most companies I come across in Australia, which is really staggering given the diversity of things that we want to do and want to achieve. Particularly graduates that are out of university, quite often they don't like to use email. They try and shy away from email. I'm actually one of those people. I hate email. I try and avoid it. So again, what other channels can those people use? But often in work, we force people to use certain channels. So we force people to use email. They might not want to use it, but we still force them. So we need to rethink. I think it's a very broader, a bigger question. And maybe the COVID-19 crisis is our disrupting moment that gives us that opportunity to rethink things. And maybe to, not saddle people with certain tools. How about we have a lot more flexibility around what we do? I think that's the key to the generational gap. That's a really tough question. Yeah. I'd love to maybe do an experiment, like get some different people together and see if we can run an experiment on that. That'd be awesome.
Thanks a lot for sharing your insights. It was a great having you on this podcast talking about culture change and transformation. I'm sure that all the viewers will have some great takeaways, practical insights to do that. So thank you so much for making it on. And the blind date went awesome, in my opinion.
We did. That's right. Fantastic. It's so fantastic to be here, Suresh. Thank you so much for the invite. For all your viewers, check out my website, digitalcolmer.com, and you can follow me at digitalcolmer. We haven't really talked about it, but I've done stand-up as well. So I do this stand-up on the side and have some fun on YouTube. All good. But thank you so much.
Thank you.